on.
So anyway, during the 60s, protests were quite prevalent. And before the convention in Chicago in 68, there was a whole different attitude toward drugs. It wasn't associated with anything or anybody except drugs. And I'd got appointed to a committee to work on a set of standards for accreditation of drug rehabilitation centers funded by Health, Education, and Welfare. And Peter Dominic, who is a senator here, sponsored it. And I worked with some fairly interesting guys, one of which was John Burr, who had been a counter-psychological warfare guy at Fort Benning, Georgia, and an expert in that. He was also, I think he was head of medicine at Mount Airy Hospital. Anyway, there's some luminaries in there. And we got going pretty well. We hired an executive director from University of Denver. We had good meetings, and we were going along. The view of the whole drug situation was that of a medical problem. How do we handle it as a medical problem? Then the election comes. Nixon gets in, with the stroke of a pen, changes it from a medical to a law enforcement problem.
Oh, man.
Now,
what a different world it'd be.
As soon as that happened, the first cases I got, they were good. They were a good thing. They were minor cases. One was a case in Greeley where the cops stopped a student and saw him put something in his mouth at the last minute. So they assumed he was eating marijuana. And they put him in a headlock, got a paper napkin, and got 3 specks off his teeth that they claimed was marijuana. And they prosecuted him for possession.
Wow.
And it was a serious prosecution.
Yeah, wow.
Now, this kid was pretty well connected. His father was connected to an Italian group in Connecticut and had some places at Yale. So I had some backing, some pretty good backing there, and we raised hell with it. Then another one, his father was an IRS agent. He was being hassled in Greeley. So the students became vulnerable. First case I had here were students. Now, it really got intricate as it got more involved. But rarely did I have anyone over 30 on a drug case. So I had this one drug case, for instance, in Denver, and they were a band playing in a place I used to hang out at. And we went to a hearing on suppression of evidence. And the cop's story was they were walking down this alley listening to this noise coming from 4 floors or 3 floors above them. And it was the band practicing. And when they were in the alleyway, they smelled the telltale odor of marijuana. So they climbed 3 flights of stairs up the fire escape, looked into the window, and saw something baking in the oven with the door open. And so they went in through the window and some through the front door and busted 6 people for possession of marijuana. Now, at the hearing, it was interesting because I listened to the testimony and I cross-examined her and I said, what way does smoke go? It generally rises.
Yeah.
How wide was the alley? And I essentially proved on cross-examination that it was bullshit.
Yeah.
So I ended it by saying, I don't know about you or my other colleague here, but if I were the judge in this case, I would be pretty offended that somebody would insult my stupidity to such a degree. So they dismissed the case. And there was a little battle like that going on for quite a while. Had another case where they pulled this guy over. He had long hair. They pulled him over and searched his vehicle, found 3 seeds,
Oh my goodness.
marijuana seeds.
Yeah.
And the statute is you had to germinate them, let them grow to prove it was marijuana, and the female part of the plant, etc. So I asked for a sample of the seeds and things like that. I rousted them to where they let go. At the same time, there was a major arrest busted up by the cops at Apollo Supermarket here in Boulder. And it was a 600-pound transfer. So they went from one extreme to another.
Yeah.
And the 600-pound transfer, we took it to trial. And at the end of the prosecutor's case, they took the 600 pounds of marijuana and placed it in the courtroom. And you could hear, you could smell that damn thing all over the courthouse. It was funny as hell. So we lost that one.
Yeah.
And then I filed a bunch of motions, and we got a postpone on various appeals for 2 years. And the guy ended up with 6 months in jail for 5 months. So that's the way things were right at the beginning. I had a case in Wyoming then. These guys had a veritable drugstore in a way. Both of them were servicemen. Both of them had their first, they were young, they were just discharged. Both of them had their first taste of drugs, marijuana, when they were in Vietnam. And this was also a case. And it was a hair thing. That's why they wrote that musical Hair. So hair was the identifier that you could have maybe 60% odds of picking up a doper. So you didn't worry about anything else. So that's sort of how it started. And it got really, really, really political. I had one case where the daughter of the state Supreme Court clerk was sitting at a student meeting, and students' meetings were also being infiltrated by various government agencies, Operation Chaos, the FBI one, and all this kind of stuff. It was amazing what was going on there. And I was in the middle of that because it's a student center. The CIA had its group going and things. The president of the University of Colorado at one time was a CIA operative while that was going on during that period of time. And I was involved in a few CIA cases that I didn't know at the time. So anyway, they're sitting in this group discussing politics, protests, etc. And somebody lights up a joint and they pass it around. And it goes to this one guy, he snuffs it out and sticks it in his pocket. A week later, the whole crew was arrested. And they charged him with sale of marijuana because the statute says possess, sale, or transfer. And hand to hand was a transfer. Now, hopefully, although the prosecutor didn't have any, the judge here had some common sense, and they dismissed that one.
Yeah.
Another case, which was funny, this student had some weed in his locker, a couple baggies or something. So his father lived next door to a local congressman here named Don Brussman. And he was a Navy captain going up in front of Congress to be confirmed for his first star, submarine commander, etc. So his kid's in the CU gym one day, and the cops come in, and they were staking out his locker. They knew they were going to get him with his weed. So he goes to the locker, and all of a sudden they jump out, show their badges, and say, "You're under arrest." He bolts. So the cops take a few shots at him.
Did they get him?
No.
Oh.
But he called his dad and said, "What do I do?" His dad called Brotsman, and Brotsman called me, and that's where it started. Well, the judge in that case was an old-time lawyer. He'd been a probate lawyer. He was very conservative. but the old school type.
Yeah.
So he'd also been a Navy lieutenant during the war. So the captain blows off his Senate appearance, has his full regalia uniform on, and walks past the court clerk into the judge's chamber and starts berating him. Says, "What the hell kind of outfit are you guys running here, shooting at kids?" And the judge, almost in tears, he didn't shut up for 10 minutes. So the judge called the prosecutor and I in the office and said, "I don't want to proceed with this."
Wow.
And that's what happened. So there was other ways of experimentally handling some of these cases.
Yeah.
And one of the problems here is that there was a lot of political power in this case because it was a prep school and a party school, etc.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I represented 8 or 9 grandkids of senators, 36 congressmen, generals and armies. Generals and admirals. One of my clients was the wife of the general that was in charge of the Kent State thing. So there's a lot of crossroads there,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons that I got as much information as I was, because I wasn't really establishing a law practice, but I was gathering material to teach college, and I got a hell of a lot of material that way.
I bet.
And it was kind of fun, actually.
Yeah.
So what next thing happened is at Kodak, at the drug thing, the committee that I was on, we started getting more and more police officer types coming to our board meetings. Muskie's head of security and things like this. And we were wondering what the hell was going on. Then Nixon starts the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act. And all of a sudden you had, with the stroke of the pen, like I said, you had it all criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Vietnam veterans I tried in, first off, they were arrested in Laramie. There were students, and Laramie had students up there. So our defense was the deal instituted in Cheyenne or in Laramie, Wyoming. They induced these people to come from Colorado to Wyoming to sell drugs. And there were some cases about you can't encourage people to commit illegal acts.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things we were talking about then. Well, the prosecutor there, Lynn Reese was his name. He kept threatening me, saying, "If you don't stop all this bullshit with motions," because I was making a lot of work for him, "I'm going to turn this case over to the feds." Now, he had offered me a 10-year deal. If I pleaded my clients guilty, he'd make sure they wouldn't get more than 10 years. And he says, "You file another motion, and I'll turn this case over to the feds." I said, "Oh, please, Mr. E, don't turn this over to the feds." And I file another motion, sort of like Brer Rabbit. And I'd had a lot of drug cases by then, but when I first appeared in court in Laramie, Reese came up and he says, "Well, you're kind of young. I'll go easy with you." He says, "You ever done a drug case?" And I said, "No, Mr. Reese, I have never done a drug case up here." After the preliminary hearing, when I shredded his cop, he said, "Blood, I thought you said you hadn't done a drug case before." I said, "No, I said I hadn't done one in Wyoming before." So this went on for a while. They turned it over to the federal courts. And the federal courts were just starting to get involved. So the judge we had was a judge named Bremer. And we made a deal with the prosecutor on the Youthful Offenders Act. And it was a winnable case. I could have won it, but they didn't want to take the risk. And one of the things that the judge said after we did the plea for the deal, which was a minor charge, it wasn't minor, but it was not that big either. And on the Youthful Offenders Act, they would have reduced it. But he knew the background. They'd been Vietnam vets. They'd done this, they'd done that. And we get into court for sentencing, and he says, you know, I've been reading about this marijuana stuff in journals and things like that. And he says, I'm not convinced it should be illegal. Now, this is a federal judge in the state of Wyoming, one of the most conservative states in the country.
Yeah.
And he said, I'll tell you what, this is such a highly publicized case, I just can't throw it out. He was also politically aware.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what are you going to do? And he says, well, I'll tell you what, if you trust me, I'll sentence him to the full 3 years at oh shit, it was Oklahoma City, whatever that, El Reno. He says, and you can file a motion for resentencing within 90 days, and I'll resentence them to probation.
Wow.
So I tell that to the clients, and he says, you really got to believe that. And I said, well, we don't have a choice. I believe it, and because he talked logically. He wasn't an ideologue, let's get him or not. And that's what happened, and that's what they did. And at first, they called me from El Reno, and they said, everybody here doesn't believe we're going to be gone in 30 days, and we drove our cars down here. They're all making fun of us. And I mean, 90 days. 90 days later, they were eating their words. And Hoover at that time, head of the FBI, wouldn't let his men get involved in drug trafficking because of the corruption it engendered. So that was the DEA, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and these zealots. Well, they were really zealots. And this was sort of a training ground for them. And the word on the street, you could always tell a Fed because their shoes were shined. And it's pretty true. Well, this goes on for a while, and it keeps escalating, and it became obvious that this was more political. So I transferred my study and my goon squad or my informer network. Any of us successful had to have an informer network, more on the politics of the situation. So there's this one raid on 13th Street, and I heard from a secretary in the police office who had typed the affidavit for the warrants, they were going to raid the place. So I go up there and I said, I've got word they're going to raid here. You guys better clean it up. So I sat on the front porch talking to one of them while everybody in the house, it was like a crash pad. Everybody in the house started cleaning up, things like that. And then I left. And within 10 minutes, the cops were there. They were watching for me to leave. They thought it'd be kind of a bad scene if they arrested me with the other guy. It would have been bad ink.
Yeah.
So anyway, they arrest these guys, and I get an hour or two later, I get a call from the guy that was running the house. And I said, well, I thought you guys cleaned up everything. He said, well, we did, except for this one girl crashing here. She didn't believe us, and she left all of her mushrooms on the sink. And the cops hit the place, and I ate them all. Said, you gotta come down here and get me out, man. So I go down and get him. And this was when Pearl Street didn't have the mall, it was a street. So the jail's at Canyon and Broadway. I go down Broadway and start turning right at Pearl, which is 2 blocks away. All of a sudden, the guy says, stop the car. And I stop the car, and he opens the door and leans out and goes, yeah. And then he says, far out, man. I'm seeing purple and orange and green and yellow. He was tripping right then and describing it. Now, I couldn't make some of these stories up. I mean, it was a colorful day. It was fun. It really was.
Oh, it sounds like it.
And until the Nixon administration got a little more serious, when all the big money got involved. But I took him up to this restaurant where his girlfriend worked, and it was called Magnolia Thunder Pussy up on the hill. And she fed him mustard and milk. better than pumping her stomach.
Yeah.
And he was heaving up on the counter, and she was mopping up after it. I mean, it was a funny thing when you think about all of it.
Yeah. After it's done.
Yeah. Now this guy happened to have been one of the originators of Sunshine Acid, which they were manufacturing up Sunshine Canyon. They had everybody believing it came out of Berkeley. But Sunshine Acid was named after Sunshine Canyon.
Oh, wow. Okay. Not know that.
Now he comes back later with a diamond smuggling thing out of South Africa and bringing a load of ergotamine tartrate into the country a couple of years later. He was a big time smuggler by then. And this was sort of the way things were. And at that time, I was the only lawyer in town who would do a drug case because of the stigmata. And then pretty soon the lawyers discovered that you could maybe make some money out of it, and they all started advertising it and things like that. But it was kind of a funny experience. I enjoyed it. And again, I never planned to be here for more than a year anyway. So what the hell?
Yeah.
And then the next one that popped up, well, right about then, there's another case that I worked on for another lawyer, and it involved the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And he got busted here. Not for marijuana. And now there's a few cases where the method of entrapment I thought was illegal and immoral. One of the cases finally I got dismissed. They sent an informer into this guy. No, wait, they captured the prince's roommate, Lubber,
Yeah.
and busted her and turned her to set up the prince. Now, she plants marijuana on the mantle. They go in, they make a raid, and they bust him. And they were doing it only for the headlines. Get tough on crime thing. But anyway, the original group he worked with that he hired, we essentially said we could get him off and raise a little hell with it. And we lined him up on a polygraph test, which he passed. So I said, we're going to write this up, send it to the Saudi embassy with the polygraph test, and at the same time send it to New York Times, Washington Post, etc. Back then, I was also one of the few lawyers that was using the press.
Smart.
So we do that, and he comes in and he says, to the guy I was working with, he said, I got to let you go. I got to get different counsel. And I'm sitting there, and I said, what the hell for? He says, well, my family thinks there might be an immigration problem and that I should get somebody with more political clout. So I said, okay. A few months later, I'm sitting in the courthouse, and he appears and he pleads guilty to a drug charge. Now, they'd hired Brotzman's firm. Brotzman was a state rep, and he had the political clout. Well, I knew there wasn't going to be any immigration thing, but somebody didn't like that who were going to use the press. So he goes in and he pleads guilty and he gets put on probation. Well, a few years later, I'm trying a case in mid-Michigan. And I hear on the news that Patty Hearst was found in a motel 50 miles away from where I was, and that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had just got there and whacked his father. Now, the girlfriend, when they leave Boulder, she goes to work in San Francisco for Bechtel Corporation. Now, 3 of the executives in the Reagan administration were Bechtel employees, Bechtel officers. Bechtel's always had strong things with the government. They developed the Saudi oil fields and things like that. So she was working there in a personnel thing. The prince was going to school in Berkeley, graduate school. Now, it was curious because you have a state charge, and somehow he was under federal probation in California. But disregarding that, I'm thinking in my paranoid fashion, what the hell's going on here? This doesn't sound right. And so I come up with a scenario. No facts at all, but this is my version of what actually went on. So they set the kid up, they put him on probation, and the probation officer is actually a CIA agent. And she's pumping him up because they wanted to pull another deal like they did with Mossadegh and change regimes. What better to do that than to send in an assassin, a member of the family? And the message there is, you can't relax, you can't trust anybody if you're head of this oil empire, because you can't even trust your own family. We can get you anytime we want. And that was the type of thing the CIA was working on in those days. So my theory was the probation officer is prodding this guy. He goes home to his girlfriend, and she's saying, yeah, do it. I could be screwing the next king of Saudi Arabia. And they had the guy surrounded. So he goes over there and he whacks his uncle, or whatever. And within 6 weeks, no, 4 weeks, he lost his head.
Wow.
But I think they were telling him, if you do this, we'll make you king, etc.
Yep.
That's the way our government keeps their word.
Yep.
But that was an interesting case. Well, excuse me. Well, while I'm in Michigan, there's all the radio publicity. They're interviewing people, and they interviewed Brotsman's daughter, who knew the guy. And first off, the supposition was he was a boulder hippie and just out of his mind, and a druggie and all this kind of stuff. And then Brotsman's daughter was interviewed. She said that was an impossible theory. It was something else. Stoners don't act that way, etc. But it was the old kill a hippie for Christ type defense they were using at first. But it wasn't credible with this kid. So the other one I had, I think her father was head of Thiokol Chemical, which is Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, makes nerve gas and shit like that. The court clerk had a few other similar ones. Another interesting one is they were making other drugs illegal, and this one guy went to the hospital. They were encouraging people to go to the hospital if you're having a bad trip. So this guy goes to the hospital. His father's a physician in South Dakota, and they test him, and they give him some tranquilizers, and then call the police to arrest him. And I won that on a policy decision. You're telling people to go get treated, and then you're busting them when they turn themselves in. What kind of policy is that? It doesn't make sense.
No.
And I sold that.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Wow.
So back then, a lot of people, unless you're really involved, you didn't know why it was there, what was going on. And studying the political situation, as a sociologist, I study power, and I think, where is this coming from? What kind of political office has the power to do something or stop it? So I ran for district attorney.
You got it.
No, I didn't.
No.
They didn't like my campaign. So I had most of the young people molder it. Um,
Shoot, yeah.
that's okay. Most of the young, that was the first year that 18-year-olds could vote,
Yeah.
and I had them going there. And my platform was anti-drug enforcement, things like this.
Okay.
So
And what year was that?
72.
Okay.
Hunter Thompson ran for sheriff of Aspen about that too.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. In fact, we were trying to see who had the most outrageous uh, campaign. But Rod Putnam made some brochures for me. And it was, again, this is sort of the hippie culture that I was working with. And there were parades we go to, and I used a dump truck from Nederland Lumber Company as the stage and had a folk band from Lions. And Hunter had these fancy convertibles and shit like that, which was kind of funny. And it was, I tried to get as much contrast as possible.
Mhm.
A week before the election, the county chairman here changed the rules that you had to live in the precinct for 90 days. And the primary was September 11th. School started, they were coming back to register about the 15th of August. So none of them would have done this. So they disenfranchised a whole group. And I lost by 221 votes. But the university population at that time was 10,000.
Hmm.
So I did become a threat.
Yeah.
And and the cases kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. There was all kinds of political entrapment. Um, during this time, I had a client from Illinois named Gilya Tannenbaum and another one from Illinois named Thomas Rhea. And that caused a feud that has been written about and much publicity about, um, that caused a schism between Hoover and Richard Helms of the CIA. David Wise of the Washington Post wrote it in one of his books, the chapter 9 called Vanished. It was a subject of quite a few days of the Kerry Committee, um, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and for me it was an absolute career changer.
Yeah.
And it's still open for investigation. And it's interesting because the district attorney I ran against wasn't a bad guy. He gave me access to the file. And what the file showed was bizarre. She had sent 2 letters to me that somehow got delivered to the FBI. And she was in the state mental hospital as a result of a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Well, the letter said essentially, this isn't going the way I was promised. Get down here, get me out of this place. I'm afraid being here. It was a cry for help. Now, on the cases, an attorney out of Denver defended her on that. I'll get into the whole complex thing a little bit later in another video, I think. The mail got delivered to the FBI instead of me, as I said. Yeah, and the report said that the autopsy, see, she was in there and committed suicide, according to the legend. And the narrative of that, she was in a group session. She was participating and then went out in the hall, got a can of Coca-Cola to bring in. 20 minutes later, she nodded off, and 25 or 26 minutes later, she was dead.
Wow. What was it?
Sodium cyanide is what they said.
Wow.
But the curious thing about the autopsy, cyanide is very toxic.
Yeah.
There were no burn marks on her tongue, no burn marks on her esophagus, and there was sodium cyanide burn marks on the back side of her stomach. So the only logical way for me that could have been handled is when they cut her open for the autopsy and spread the stomach to look in there. They threw some in there and then diagnosed it as suicide.
Wow. Wow.
Now, at the same time, there was a hit murder thing here involving a woman named Joan Garner Brown. Her husband was Robert K. Brown, and Robert K. Brown was recruiting for the Bay of Pigs. He was an intelligence officer and owned and edited Soldier Fortune magazine. He worked with General Singlov on the Phoenix Project, which was the assassination project in Vietnam. This is all local here. And I just stumbled into this shit. So anyway, my belief is that Tannenbaum was sent down there to somehow figure out what the deal was with Joan Carter Brown. Now in 64, I think it was, she executed the head of the student American Nazi movement, made him kneel down and executed him behind the head with a bullet. And they pleaded her not guilty by reason of insanity, and she got sent to the state hospital in Pueblo till she was sane enough to be released. So there was Tannenbaum and Joe Carter Brown there, and the same kind of people manipulating behind. Now, this leaves all kinds of fantasy. You could make up a lot of shit on this. In fact, I tried to write a couple of screenplays about this. And it was really bizarre. In the Tannenbaum case, if you look at some of the information back down there, it was bizarre. Anyway, I looked at old files, and the current DA won't let me have access, claiming it's an open case. Now, I think somebody's trying to keep people know I'm talking about it in writing. It's 50 years old, and it was very famous back then. And I think somebody's got to the DA here to quiet him and not to cooperate. It's the only thing that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So we're back to bribing DAs now.
Yep.
And under the guise of patriotism.
Yeah. Patriotism.
Yeah. Same as Snowden and some of those other.
Yeah.
But that's sort of how it started out, and that's why I ran for office.
Yeah.
And a lot of the older cases, most of them were kind of funny that way.
Yeah. It's a lot of corruption, a lot of years.
Well, it wasn't corruption. It was the fact that they weren't law enforcement. There was no intent to enforce drug laws.
Yeah.
They were trying to get to draft dodgers, radicals, SDS, and people like that, because they associated it with drugs. Most returning vets, for instance, smoked weed. So that was the only real logic. But Ehrlichman, Haldeman, all those guys put that together. And one of the things that most people haven't researched or thought about is most of those people in Nixon's cabinet had law degrees, but they were actually working for public relations firms. They were in advertising, propaganda, etc. So Nixon structured something sort of like Hitler did with Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda unit. Then they funded things like programs. Ephraim Zimbalist's FBI, another one, I forgot what his name was, about Treasury Department. They had a law and order things coming up. Then they started the thing, the marijuana menace, going clear back to Anson's time. And the gateway theory, marijuana is the first step to heroin. And what happened during that is our society turned in from a rational group to as one of the employees I had once, she'd gone to McCormick Theology School and was also minister. And the first time she went to court, she came back. She said, I wrote my thesis on apocalyptic thinking, and I just saw a perfect example of it. She went to court in Jefferson County, and I'd never thought of this, but the courts started to behave as though it were apocalyptic, the same way as the government did on the Vietnam. If we don't stop them in Vietnam, we're going to have to stop them at Golden Gate. And that's the way they sold the war. That's the way they marketed war. That's the way they market the war on drugs. If we don't stop it now, your daughter's going to become a prostitute, a heroin addict, etc. And they were successfully marketing under those positions, which is entirely apocalyptic. So no matter what marijuana was, good, bad, or ugly, but it was a gateway drug, and we had to stop it, or else the world would go to hell. And very little analysis was done of that. And that's another thing. Most lawyers are too busy making money or whatever to really think deeply and intellectually about the causal relationship. And that fascinated me more than anything.
Yeah.
But I didn't make any money either. So anyway,
Oh. Yep, we're good.
yeah, I figured 40 to 45 minutes. And
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty good. That's some wild stuff.